Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Move to Cloud, a chance to finally transform security, sponsored by Chronicle Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromiley, SANS Digital Forensics and Incident Response Instructor, Dr. Anton Shavakin, Head of Solution Strategy at Chronicle and Google Cloud, and Brandon Levine, Head of Applied Intelligence at Chronicle and Google Cloud. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Matt.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carol. And thanks everyone who's joining us here today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I tell you what, we got a star-studded lineup here today. I'm super excited to be joined by Anton and Brandon here, and I know they're very, very excited to talk us through some of these different concepts here as well. So before we get started, because the way this is going to work, for those of you who have likely probably seen some of our webcasts before, and I know for a fact some of you have seen Brandon and I go through some webcasts as well. This webcast is going to be one which is going to be very, very heavily focused on, how can we do things better? How can we do things right? And we're going to really focus on concepts such as how do I think about my end state from a security perspective, and where are my tool sets based, and how am I utilizing my tool sets? And personally, just in preparing this webcast and kind of talking to Brandon and Anton, seeing where their heads are at and the way that we're going to go through this here, I really want those of you watching to go through and I want you to ask yourself some really, really deep questions about your environment, your current security setup. And I want this to be a very thought-provoking webcast for you. And I know the three of us on this side are going to make it that way as well. But I want you all to take a chance as you're watching this, compare what we're saying to your organization. Some of the things that we say might ring true. Some of them might hit a little too close to home. It's okay, right? We're all here together. Our goal is all the same: keep bad guys out, make headaches, stop them from doing things they're not supposed to be doing. But again, utilize what we're going to go over here and utilize these content, utilize these topics, because I think it's something that a lot of folks need to hear from a security perspective. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anton to walk us through what today's agenda is going to look like. But like I said, everyone, as you're watching, as you're listening here, we'll read between lines, see what we're saying, and think how this can apply to your org and maybe how you can take some steps to kind of level things up in the future. But over to you, Dr. Shavakin.
Perfect. Thank you. So here's a funny backstory behind this webinar. So it started as a blog post that Brandon and myself wrote, kind of trying to address the Security Awareness Month, but focusing on a particular subject that's kind of dear to our hearts, namely how people use the cloud and how people secure cloud. And I think that as we were writing the blog post, we kind of thought, wow, this can be much bigger than blog post. This can also help people understand how they're actually securing what's in the cloud, how they're using cloud securely or not, and what it all means for an overall evolution of security, perhaps. I mean, I'm making some glamorous promises here, but let's get to the details. One thing I wanted to start with is, apart from introductions, is to look at very briefly at the history of how security was always an add-on to something. And I think I've met vendors who promised that in their technology, security is in fact there from day one. And once I kind of looked at this technology more specifically, I realized, nah, maybe not so much. So I wanted to very quickly and somewhat humorously present my view of the history of how security was always an add-on and was almost never started as an initial design criteria or initial design choice. We also wanted to look at bring this to the cloud and see how people actually do it in modern cloud computing. Then, of course, any no security webcast is valid without a brief discussion of failures and problems. It'll happen. But afterwards, we're going to jump straight to the constructive and try to present a few ideas or maybe a few requirements that, in our opinion, would help people transform, and I think it's a big word, transform their security as you migrate to the cloud. Finally, we're going to present a few examples based on our experiences where this was maybe done, maybe not done so much, but at least you'd see how the criteria we'll present would be framed by the examples. And of course, some actionable recommendations would follow. Admittedly, as I said before, the webcast isn't very technical, but there would be some things that will help, as Matt said, you to think about how you're doing things in the cloud and perhaps even on-prem. So to start off, I wanted to have somewhat funny and somewhat sad history of security, rather of technologies, which started their life, and you can debate whether the internet really started in the 80s, in the 1980s. Some people would say 1969 DARPANET, others would say maybe late 80s when it started to be adopted. But the point is, don't obsess about the dates. The point is, a lot of network protocols, a lot of other components of the internet started without any, or without much, admittedly, probably without any thinking about security. Operating systems back in the 80s and 90s, Windows, I'm picking on Windows here because, hey, in the 1990s, this was the subject of big abuse by attackers. But hey, after 10 years, it became the mobile platform that started to be the security punching bag. Still, I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but the idea is that, in my opinion, and I think that's an opinion based on observing the industry for some number of years, we haven't really built any technologies in the realm of IT or realm of digital where security was in fact present from day one. So it's kind of a sad history of security going back almost half a century at this point, being added later. And I think some people quote this as kind of a universal truth. So why don't we discuss it? Have any of us seen examples of security being included from day one in a new technology? You know, I don't have any prize money, but I think that it would be kind of amazing if one of you can name an example of something that was actually secured from start, from birth. Brandon, Matt?
Man, I have nothing. I really can't think of anything like that. I'm actually still thinking about like, internet protocols that are still actually not secure, like things like BGP or DNS. So I think I can come up with way too many examples of things that still don't have any security included in them, or at least by default, rather than finding anything that actually fits this criteria. Matt?
I got one for you guys. A buddy of mine started a small business. He went and got a laptop to power his small business, and he brought it home from Best Buy, and it didn't work. It didn't log in. So day one of his business, he had no internet access, and therefore he was secure from everything that we're talking about. But no, I don't have a ground up, and this is where I'm cheeky answer. But where I'm taking this question here is there anyone ground up who was like, hold on? Let's put security in front of every decision we make. No. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of it's been not only, and you bring up a good point, and not only is it like an afterthought, but it's a reactionary afterthought as well.
Yep.
I mean, it's only done because you had to.
Yep. I mean, admittedly, in the blog post, I kind of try to cheat and to find the counterexample myself. And I think that I found a really pathetic counterexample. So I'll try it, and then I'll probably just destroy it myself. So those of you who are very old, I mean, admittedly, I'm not very old, but those of you who remember the Rainbow books or the Origin of Common Criteria probably would remember that there was a class of a system. I think in the Orange book, it was called A1 rated, and in Common Criteria, I think it's a CC level, I don't know, 7, like the highest level there can be. It's supposed to be secure, verified design. Of course, nobody has ever seen that system, or maybe very few people has, or maybe those systems didn't even exist. I think to me, this is the only example I found that is very old and is not in wide use. So that's kind of, and even that is, I don't have firsthand knowledge of how these systems are built. So it's hard for me to say that they are in fact an example, but nothing more recent and nothing more practical.
I mean, maybe something like thin clients in terms of how people used to interact with mainframes, but I don't actually think that was security design. I think that was more of a physical location design, whereas a mainframe was the size of a damn building. You could have a thin client or a viewer into it. I don't think that was actually anything more than just convenience rather than security. So I really can't come up with anything that works here.
It's possible that it is in fact a universal law, at least up to now. So that's why I'm always somewhat skeptical when a vendor would claim that their technology is security from the ground up. I still somehow doubt it. Okay, so this is kind of, I think that the reactions from you guys are kind of what I expected, frankly, because it's, even if somebody finds an example that would take a lot of brain power and a lot of head scratching, and then let's say, yay, hey, there's one. So it would still be kind of a self-defeating argument. So now, some people think of it as a universal law, but is that really the truth? Can things change? And I'm going to try to propose that perhaps migration to the cloud is that chance. But then whether I'll convince you or not is a separate story. So let's try it. So in fact, in my Twitter discussions on the same topic, I kind of failed to convince some people and maybe convinced others. So before we go further, I want to kind of step away from this philosophical discussion and go to a more practical discussion, namely how people actually secure what they have in public cloud today. Now, lots of people by now remember the magic words joint responsibility or customer responsibility or shared responsibility, where a workload that's running in Google Cloud or any other cloud provider is jointly secured by the provider in some regards and by the client. Now, even compliance standards, and the example here on this slide is the PCI DSS joint responsibility matrix that shows that there would be certain things, certain responsibilities for requirements that go to the cloud provider and to a client. Now, apart from that, there's a choice that there are more choices. You can have, for example, provider build the tools and then either give them to the cloud customers or sell them to cloud customers. There's also a choice where a cloud customer simply brings their own existing security tools. Now, this is how we end up with cloud computing instances that run antivirus or like host firewalls and a few things that are built way, way before cloud. And of course, there are also examples where cloud customers purchases tools specifically for securing cloud, but not from a cloud provider. They buy it from a separate vendor. So admittedly, these are the ones I've seen. And I think, of course, the most real world environments are a mix of that. So you may use some controls built by the underlying platform. You can bring your own. You can bring some legacy tools. But the idea is that nowhere in that picture is that you show up at the cloud and everything is just magically secure. Somebody else, little gnomes living in the basement, just made everything magically secure exactly to the level you want. No more, no less. So that's just a complete joke, right? That doesn't exist. So in essence, the joint responsibility is there, and it's kind of almost a law that if you're securing the cloud, you would have some responsibility. Again, compliance says so, reality says so. Now, if you're facing the choice, would you prefer to trust a cloud provider as a source for security tools for securing what you run in the cloud? Would you prefer a third-party vendor, or would you just bring your legacy tools? And please don't pile on the approach for bringing the legacy tools. We may think that philosophically it's wrong, but we also know that operationally that's what people do. I mean, back in my analyst days, back in my Gartner analyst days, I've had a fair number of questions about installing and configuring a SIEM in the cloud, and even installing and configuring firewalls in the cloud. And these people sometimes wouldn't question, do I need a firewall in the cloud? Do I need my firewall appliances in the cloud? They just go and do it because that's what they've done in the data center. So what are some of the top pros and cons for each of the approaches? Let me flip back to the previous slide for the approaches. Brandon? Matt?
Sure. So I think for the first one, a cloud security provider or a cloud provider bringing the security tools, I think that provides probably the most streamlined approach to this, wherein you have things that are as close to deployment time, real time as possible. And you also get a significant amount of control from the provider side as far as having integrated and transparent security as well. And by transparent, I mean, things that are opt-out, specifically opt-out. I think every other solution here denotes that you must have security as part of your consideration and then add it on. And while that does come into play with compliance, it's sort of a minimal standard. So I think probably the ideal solution is to have some combination of the ability for third-party vendors to be able to shore gaps for specialized applications, but have a baseline sort of deployment that is opt-out for all clients.
Okay, and you're not just saying it because our salaries are paid by GCP, right?
No. I mean, I've been working to learn a lot more about the various cloud environments as well, and I think that. I don't want to harp on the legacy tools thing because that is, it's really a detriment to this whole transformative process. And I think the third-party tools are viable, I think that allows for hyper specialization, so very specific applications or very specific purposes. But I think having a baseline security default allows us to remove some of the questions around confusions around controls for users when they're just getting started, when they're deploying massive deployments, or anything in between. I think when you have security by default, which we really haven't encountered before, you have a genuine opportunity to raise the sort of bar or the barrier to entry for attackers.
That makes sense. Yeah, Matt, anything?
I was actually, Brandon, you almost verbatim did one of the things I was going to say there about kind of the baseline cybersecurity things. I think, I think a combination of these things is necessary, Anton, and really my primary reason for this, and I think we're going to talk about this actually a little bit later on as well, but I like the idea of kind of a cloud provider bringing security tools, setting that baseline up, and to Brandon's point, raising that minimum barrier of entry, if you will. But I think the other thing here is that you, as a vendor, you need to be aware of what type of data you're going in. And you mentioned this, and you were kind of circling around it when you talked about like regulatory data or things that have. And there's a screenshot of PCI DSS on this slide, right? So to me, that immediately screams like you should know what type of environment, what type of data is inside of your environment, and if you need to augment that for that particular data, I think that falls onto kind of that combination of the above, where you can't just throw data into a cloud. And even, yes, there's some minimum security, you can't assume that minimum security is enough. And I think the other reason the combination needs to be shouldered responsibility between both is because, we're going to talk about open instances and vulnerable software right out of the gate when it comes to data storage. And there's far too many instances where I've assisted someone with a data breach, and they're just absolutely surprised at the type of data that they have. And there was definitely an underlying assumption of like, oh, but we're in such and such, and we thought that was safe. Yep. And I think it's got to be a shouldered responsibility here. And I think, the fifth option, if you will, or 4A to add to combination of the above is customer declares what data they're throwing in there, right? Customer says, oh, hey, FYI, we're going to be putting PCI or PII or something in here. And maybe that, draws additional attention to what the bare minimum should be, as opposed to, oh, I'm just spinning up a quick big table just to check a couple things, right? Just to do a POC or something like that. So I think it's really a combination of things, but this is a fantastic question.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I think the PCI screenshot on the right also reminds us that the viability for the approach number 2, where your existing, currently deployed, so pre-cloud security tools will in fact travel together with you to the cloud. Like say PCI specifically names firewalls, it names WAF, web application firewalls, it names inside requirement 10, it kind of almost names a SIM, and a bunch of other stuff, right? And so you almost like, if you follow the standard, you're given those old names, tools that were built pre-cloud, and it kind of like implies that, hey, do I need to use security groups, or do I need to use a firewall? Do I need to use some kind of a filter provided by a CSP cloud provider, or do I need to bring my own WAF? So I think we can all agree that philosophically using pre-cloud security tools in the cloud is going to be troublesome, but it's also something that is done widely. And
I think there's an interesting thing on that point, is that there doesn't exist much of a translation layer of a firewall is what in the cloud. So a firewall, an on-premise appliance is a little bit different than what it would be in the cloud. A WAF in the cloud would be different. Networking is completely different. So the considerations around those technologies are very different. And there really has been very little effort to translate legacy technology in context of the cloud.
Yes,
I will jump on that. Brandon, you were going right where I was going too. Is I feel bad actually for a lot of data custodians out there who have to adhere to those particular standards. And maybe this is actually one of the true solutions here. Is maybe option 5 should be regulatory bodies or compliance bodies or whatever they are need to actually update what that means. Because I tell you, I've sat in some of those audits, and someone will walk in, and I mean, if you think about it, right, from a security perspective, what is a firewall trying to do? why do you insist this sits in front of my data? And can I achieve that same thing? It's just not called a firewall out of the box.
Yeah.
And if so, then as far as I'm concerned, you're still compliant. But maybe I could give a little here and say that the regulation should potentially be updated as well to reflect the newer state of.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that makes sense as an approach. Yes, I think that's sort of interesting to see how it would evolve in the future. Would it change? Would it be renamed, or something else? I mean, to me, this is kind of an interesting one to watch. I wouldn't necessarily immediately say this is all dead. So,
and I agree. I don't think the concept of the firewall, the concept of a load balancer, the concept of of a WAF and those types of things, or even host visibility, are dead per se. I just think that you're trying to apply a name or a label to something that had a very specific definition when it was originally created, a few years ago, or 10 years ago, 15 years ago, versus something that is now modern that doesn't necessarily fit within that box anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So the translation layer, or you would end up with a lot of things that are very strangely named. Like you would use legacy names for things where they just don't make sense, only to satisfy the auditors. Okay, so to progress, and I think that despite these approaches, I want to progress down to the low point of the presentation, namely the discussion of the problems. Now, again, in my Gartner days, I've spent quite some time actually analyzing what are the realistic security problems in the cloud. Because when you read some of the materials written by others, you think that you would develop an impression that all sorts of esoteric break-offs, side channel attacks, or memory attacks, or something that's very heavy into virtualization of cloud is kind of the thing. And admittedly, those exist, but what we've seen in the news in regards to cloud problems are very often something that pretty much predates the cloud. Because hey, we had many years ago, we used to have directory permissions, and now we have OpenS3 buckets, right? So some of the cloud problems we hear about in real world are kind of very pre-cloud, if I call it. Well, hard-coded API keys perhaps is the modern problem, but say OpenS3 bucket permissions, access control of firewall configuration errors, to me, there's nothing modern technology about them. So some of the cloud security failures, in fact, traveled with us to the cloud. They are pre-cloud. To me, that's a peculiar thing, because I would say that as we adopt more technologies that are cloud specific, or more operational approaches, like say DevOps or other principles or methods, you'd think the problems would start showing up that are native to those approaches. But in real life, I think we see a lot more of the kind of approaches that predate cloud, except for perhaps hard-coded API keys being forgotten somewhere, or something of that sort. So cloud security failures, to me, are also kind of feeding the legacy narrative here a little bit. And I would say that we do see a fair amount of certain problems. And how do we explain those problems? And here's the kicker. My former employer for 8 years had this quote, which I think was first coined maybe 3-4 years ago, and then it's been updated a few times. So the latest iteration that I've seen says something like this: through 2025, which is 6 years into the future, 99% of cloud security failures would be the customer's fault. Now, some of you become really angry when you see this. Some of you become more like, yeah, duh, that's pretty obvious. So still, this is based by the data available to Gartner, and this is kind of, while it looks at the future, it is very much connected or nailed to the present data. But what does it actually mean? And I think this, philosophizing a little bit about this line, would lead us to an actual conclusion of this webinar. So let's briefly talk about this. Is it fair to blame cloud customers for nearly all security problems? And to me, 99% is friggin' nearly all. So is this fair? And I think this is fair sounds ethical, or sounds very mushy and layer 8. So perhaps we can have a discussion about this.
Yeah, hey, Anton, Matt, I'll jump in first. So, I tell you what, when I saw this statistic for the first time, I am literally the definition of indifferent right now. I'm right on the fence about it. Meaning, if I have a team of developers who were all trained by people, they're very, very good developers. They write amazing applications. They adhere to all of the things that my company does and all of the policies that we have in place, and they write code the way I want to, and so on and so forth, and all of those things happen, and we still suffer a breach at that point, then I mean, is it, does it fall on us? Me, if I'm the customer, if I'm the lead developer, the one who wrote the policy, does it fall on me for not having a secure enough policy? Or, is it, how were we taken advantage of? And that's where I think the 99% is way too high, because if, the example I like to use, and we're taking a cloud focus, but one of the kind of malware-based examples I like to use is WannaCry, right? Or some of the, WannaCry is an easy one, right? If you got hit on day 1 of WannaCry, holy crap, what just happened to me, right? Day 7, day 8, and this is the other side of this coin here. Day 7, day 8, I'm kind of like, hey everyone, we've kind of known about this for a little while now, right? And I can see where Gartner may be leaning towards is like by 2025, I do think there could be somewhat of an argument to be made of, if you're running an organization that utilizes cloud technology, it's probably 100% literally impossible that you've never heard of the security risks and concerns. So why aren't they being adhered to, right? And I think I have to think that's the angle that they're coming from, which is, better, so why don't you act better? I can't imagine that Gardner is coming from the angle of, well, all of the main cloud providers are giving you everything you need to be successful. And, if you get breached, it's because you left an API key out there, or you let credentials get stolen, or you let permissions be abused, or something along those lines, where it is 100% direct blame, without focusing on why didn't you know better? Because like I said, if I have an internal policy that controls the way people write software, write code, then why isn't that policy security enhanced? I would say, yep, it falls on us as a customer, but I can't hold my customer accountable for every single type of vulnerability that could happen in the world, and then come back and be like, well, why didn't you know better?
Yeah, like basically being hit by WannaCry on day 200 is very much your fault. It's absolutely fair. It's not victim blaming, it's idiot blaming. I mean, or it's negligence rather. Maybe the more less offensive term is that. But at the same time, being hit by something novel, it's kind of hard to always see that they should have known better. And to me, with cloud, I think the 3 buckets notwithstanding, I mean, most of us who has looked at the controls in that particular cloud provider would come to realize that it's actually kind of hard to make it public by mistake. So that's the thing. I mean, it's almost like in case of S3 buckets, the argument does seem to fall on the customer, because the providers seemingly have done a fair bit to make it not happen by mistake, or by randomly clicking at things, or by people thinking, oh, what does it mean public? Oh, we'll just make it public. That sounds good, right? Like that's not what's going on. So to me, perhaps it is fair pretty often to blame cloud customers, but a more useful question is, can something be done about it from the provider side? Sorry, Brandon.
So before we get there,
go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, before we get there, and actually, and so you brought up open S3 buckets, but I'll go back really quickly to an example from a few years ago. There was a period of time, and this is actually a good portion of my research for nearly half a year. There was a significant issue with NoSQL databases being deployed, and it still is a big issue today, but there was a massive kind of global ransom event that took place a few years ago, where essentially, open HDFS, open Hadoops, open Mongos, open Elasticsearches, all of these things were being hit. And I remember having very, very detailed discussions with engineers at each one of those organizations. And at some of those organizations, they would be like, if you go to our page, the page you have to go to download this thing, it says on there, this product is bound to the internet, or it's bound to 0.0.0.0. Please do not turn this thing on. So they made enough of a disclaimer, and I think, and I'm not throwing shade or calling it what it was, because it was years ago. I think back then they were kind of like, look, we've given you all the disclaimers that you need, but our product does everything it's been advertised to do, right? If you don't have the wherewithal to deploy it securely, that's not our take. Fast forward to now, most of these products now ship bound only to local hosts.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to wonder, the argument that that they stood on very heavily years ago has all of a sudden turned into, well, you know what? We are going to ship this thing differently. And there's been even articles and blog posts that even cite, like, this stuff is being deployed unsecured. Therefore, we have to now take the step to secure it for you. And I don't know if that's necessarily, like, it's the right answer in protecting data, but I don't think it does anything to make developer practices any better, because guess what the developers do the moment they deploy it? And I've seen this. They've got scripts that go in and automatically undo all of these security changes. So at that point,
that one must be the example of the day. I think this is like undo security dot something script.
Exactly, undo security .sh, and you know that's part of your build process, right? But when it comes to something like that, where a product company has changed the way that they ship software to help make things more secure, and developers still go back to the insecure state of things, then yes, at that point in time, I think the blame winds are shifting in one direction, and it is towards the customer, because you have to ask the question then of, why don't you understand, like, how to secure this data that you're responsible for? And that I think is the question that needs to be asked, not necessarily, you know. And I'm sorry, Brandon, I don't want to cut too much into your time here, but this is a fantastic point. I think my final question I'd ask here, Anton, is like, you know, I don't necessarily want to be like, you lost the data, it's all your fault, right? I think the Gartner's statistic comes out very accusatory, which I don't like. What I'd rather see is a question of 99% of customers in 2025 don't understand data security. Therefore, right, it's leading to this. And that is maybe the problem that we have to fix. But I don't want to jump ahead on the fix. Brandon, I'm sorry, man. Over to you.
Perfect. No,
you're good. I don't normally take this tact. I'm pretty much a pessimist by nature, and I'm pretty paranoid by nature. But I think blaming cloud customers is a little like repeating the mantra of people are the weakest chain in security. I don't think that's super productive. While it may be true, it just doesn't equate to anything. Nothing. You don't gain anything by saying that. Yeah, we all sort of acknowledge that, or at least have read that a billion times. I think what is actually productive is developing these transparent and integrated security controls that are specifically opt-out, make security the default state and not a configurable add-on. I think, you know, there is a bit of overcomplication in some of the security controls, and I think that is sort of a bit of a barrier for some users, especially users that are not security professionals, in understanding how to use specific security controls appropriately. And I think that actually does lie on the providers, in that they may be providing too verbose of controls in some places where they don't necessarily need to. I don't think that you want to absolve the users of responsibility, as we talked about. You know, n minus n plus 200 for WannaCry or NotPetya is a little bit silly. But there are definitely times where extreme, I'd say, negligence is a problem. But I think that there is a demonstrable difference between negligence and misunderstanding and just poor user education in general. And requiring user education is certainly a step, but I think making it even easier, I think making these things so hard integrated, where they have to actively acknowledge, okay, this isn't secure, really could get us a lot further than just saying, okay, people are the weakest link, there's nothing we can do about it, people are the problem, boom, done.
Yeah, that's actually, you're right. It's similar philosophy to saying everything in security would fail because people would screw it up, and that's basically it. Like that cuts off any progress. And to me, this is kind of where I want to lead this discussion, namely, okay, perhaps it is directly due to something that customer has done or not done, but can the provider build something, you know, before 2025? It's a long time, right? We have time to build it. and what I mean is that, can providers do more to reduce user mistakes with security? And to me, the answer is, let's assume Gartner is correct within the effect base available, can the provider still fix the problem even though it's not theirs to fix, if that makes sense? And that's where I want to kind of go with that next. So Brendan and me kind of talked about this, maybe agonized a little bit about what we would want to see and what kind of security, maybe principles sounds too philosophical, maybe security criteria or requirements would actually make it so that this wisdom that I quoted, about 99%, would no longer be true. And by the way, originally it was not just in 2025, it was every year before that point, right? So can we build something? Can we change how we do security perhaps so that this percentage of customer blame would decrease? Or maybe that customers wouldn't make that many mistakes and problems and choices, so that maybe that undo security script would not run, or maybe other problems would not happen. So this is that list that we came up with. And I think that the examples here are a little bit maybe more nebulous sometimes, some of them are more practical. For example, Brandon came up with the concept of opt-out security, and I think it's probably his to describe. But some of the things are more clear, like a security that's there by default is actually very different to security that can be easily enabled. Now, security that's just on and you have to turn it off, perhaps not easily turn it off, to me is a big advantage and a big reason to reduce those mistakes. Now, a few other criteria here, like say transparent security, because certainly for some controls you cannot be transparent because you have to stop people from doing things and say, dude, you're not doing it right, just stop. That's not transparent. But say encryption, in many cases, encryption can be transparent. As long as you handle keys securely, you can protect the data from certain threat actors, and yet be transparent to the user. So to me, these are some of the things we described with examples, and I think I'll let Brandon explain his favorite bits.
Well, for me, so opt-out security is actually something that I learned at a previous job at a very, very large cloud services provider. And my boss actually came up with part of this concept. He came up with the corollary to this, which was Stepup Security. So opt-out security is pretty straightforward. Basically, by default, everything has the most secure settings. So you must as a user or as an admin, you must actively acknowledge that you are loosening the security posture of your services. Now, the other thing on top of that is that we had discussed at a previous job was actually something called Stepup Security, wherein you do need additional authentication to do these sorts of tasks, like say opening port 80 to the entire world, or not deploying a web server with SSL or TLS properly configured. So things like that would require actually Stepup Security, Stepup Auth, such that your role by default doesn't actually have the ability to perform those tasks, but then you must authenticate to perform that task. It's a little bit niche towards as far as configurations go, but we found or we believe that it would be a really useful sort of construct in that someone having to take the extra time to do something and to actively acknowledge something may actually not be in their best interest. Usually helps them to understand pretty quickly that what they're doing needs some further examination. And that really ties into role-based security. So I think those two are a bit, opposite sides of the same coin, wherein you have obvious security is really making security easier and making it so that a user failure doesn't necessarily mean a catastrophic cascade of failures. Mm-hmm. You should have backstops. It shouldn't be this, single failure causes everything to go haywire, causes a massive amount of vulnerabilities, etc. But you should have the ability to have by default this sort of security posture that shores up the baseline defenses.
Yep. And at the same time, I think that some of these are Well, either almost achieved by some of the cloud providers, and because the context here is cloud, and some of them are still actually quite aspirational. So for example, native to the system to me is when you guys look at this, when the audience looks at this and they think, wow, that's very self-serving, they work for a CSP, so of course they want to do native security. But the point for mentioning this is nothing to do with spend to given to us. It has to do with the fact that most security projects that fail very often fail because of integration requirements, like my favorite baby, SIM. Many projects have died because, well, misplaced expectations, of course, but also because of integration requirements, because so many pieces need to be connected together. Modern things, SOAR, is notoriously difficult in some places because it has to be integrated. So to me, if security is native to the system that you're using, in this case, cloud, to me would have advantages that go beyond just, hey, that's easy to buy, hey, that's easy to enable. It would also not have some of the very fragile integration points that unfortunately plague many projects where you have to go on-prem and integrate things.
Or just the simple engineering lift required, even if it's just copy pasting an API key. Sometimes that amount of configuration is completely forewent when deploying products. So the closer it is to being just completely native built in, the better we can position ourselves and our clients and our customers and our users ultimately in a more secure posture to prevent these types of things.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And same with automated security. Now here, I don't want to invent a new term, but the idea is that if you have an environment where things are controlled by APIs and where things are already automated very heavily, like, well, modern cloud computing, isn't it reasonable that certain security functions will be turned on after deployment by using an API rather than would need to be deployed, connected? You would need to cut and paste stuff or deploy tools or connect wires. Well, there are no wires to connect in the cloud. Still, to me, there's a lot more opportunity for automation because of APIs that are engendered by the cloud. Now, admittedly, obvious security is Brandon probably one of Brandon's favorite, but it's also one of my favorites because, as you may know, some of the security professionals, I think all security professionals fall into two groups. Some people are just believers in security awareness education, and some people are not believers in security awareness education. Whether you fall into group A or group B, you do know that training users to do something securely is a very agonizing process. Don't click on pop-ups. Don't do this. Watch for the lock. Look at this. Look at that. Don't say okay. Don't accept. Don't respond. Don't click links. I mean, that has caused a lot of problems. Of course, hey, phishing, right? Phishing is very often treated by user education, but guess what? Phishing hasn't decreased overall. So I don't want to go into a rant mode here, but the idea is that the more we think about making security obvious and not requiring education, the more secure our cloud environments would be. And I think some of the things that you see here are very much a reality in modern cloud environments. Others are not. Others are very much our dreams and our ideas for how things can be improved. I wanted to kind of touch a few examples, and I think first two perhaps are Brandon's and the third is mine because, hey, login, where these things, how this may work when these principles are in place. So Brandon, want to start with the web server example?
Sure, yeah. So typically when you are setting up a web server, you can deploy a myriad of different stacks. You can have, for example, just even between your web host, your hosting, you can have, your server software, you can have something like Nginx or Apache, and those have very discretely different sort of configurations. Now, most people favor one or the other, but if you're in an environment that requires you to have one, a specific configuration or specific sort of HTTP server due to applications, exposing a web server, to the open internet is particularly terrifying. The open internet is a pretty scary place. I believe the statistic used to be within about 2 or 3 minutes of a web server going online, it would get scanned and automatically have automated exploits thrown against it. I would imagine it's probably less than that now because I remember reading that statistic, 5 or 6 years ago now. It's probably faster now. So when you are deploying, when you are making this decision, this potentially dangerous decision, albeit a necessary one, there should be adequate security controls, vulnerability checks. If there's something that has a known vulnerability in it, how do you countenance that actually being deployed? I understand, the concept of maybe a 1 day or a 0 day, which aren't super common, but having something that has already been fixed or patched or is publicly known about is particularly, detrimental and particularly irresponsible. So I think, having these integrated checks at the time of the decision being made is very important. So it still allows you to develop on something that you may be comfortable with, but when it comes time for something to be prime time, it's live. I think those sort of integrated controls, those things ranging from vulnerability scannings to, hey, you're deploying this without SSL, having open HTTP is probably not the best thing. So even just like conducting best practices assessments at the time of a decision being made is really important. And I think that comes built in with user education. Hey, you're not doing this, or hey, this is potentially going to expose you. Having that alert or that warning come into play really does allow you to deliver really key point in time education opportunities to clients.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the container example, we can probably do it together, but I think that the idea is that today we sort of assume that people understand that if you deploy something in a container, then you, who the cloud customer, for example, who owns the container, who has the container built by the developers, is responsible for what's inside. And of course, the things around it, the management infrastructure, are maybe the provider responsibility. But that ends up being frankly broken at times because people deploy it insecurely. People have in recent number of hacks recently were due to things being done by the cloud customers deploying things insecurely, including the infrastructure. So I think that with this new type of under this principles we described, that would probably be the chance to deploy an insecure container would be dramatically reduced, even without relying on education. You had something in this example as well, Brandon, because you pointed out to this worm, right? that was affecting Docker recently.
Yeah. This one was pretty interesting. I believe my old pals at Palo Alto Networks had blogged about this, where you basically had vulnerable images that you were poisoning the marketplace, and you were having these images downloaded and allowed for spreading of a mining worm based on that. So there's a lot of ways to subvert container security that don't necessarily fall on the user, even though they are choosing which containers to deploy in their applications or to use in their applications. There are certainly concerns as far as the environment itself, what Docker images are using, or what container images are you using, what container management software are you using, what orchestrators are you using. So there are certainly a larger scale of concerns when it comes to container security than just the application that happens to be running within that container.
Yep, absolutely. And even with login example, the third example is, of course, when you look at on-prem or even at cloud-based login, log collection, log analysis, we do realize that sometimes the challenge is in enabling the right logs, collecting them, and when you get to analysis, you're already pretty tired, pretty burned out, and then you kind of suffer there. So in the cloud, in public cloud providers, we can do a lot more to have the right login show up as if by magic, because it's enabled, it's always produced, it's suitable for the purpose, namely security purpose in this case. So the idea is that if you apply the principles we discussed for transparent, not requiring user education, not requiring configuration, being native, the world of login, the world of log analysis, the world of SIEM can change quite a bit, because it would no longer be about people reading 50-page manuals to find which setting would cause a certain event ID to be logged. Now, admittedly, if you are logging within the same cloud environment, a lot of your costs would be lower, a lot of problems would be solved on the back end, and so it's easier to do. But the point is, I think there are more opportunities for doing it in a way that satisfies the principles we talked about on the previous slide. Because Some of these things are perhaps done. Certain login is there. Certain login you perhaps cannot opt out. But there are many more things that we can apply to the world of enterprise security login if you have the control of a cloud platform. So to me, there are many more opportunities where these principles would change, perhaps transform how we do security, and we try to kind of cut out the old curse of being always an add-on. So now I want to kind of get philosophical again, very briefly, and think about this. Is this change realistic, or are we doomed to bring our pre-cloud thinking, pre-cloud problems, and hence treat security as an add-on? Can cloud cut it? Can cloud cut this change or not? And I think Brandon's a pessimist, so he better speak first.
Yeah, put me on the spot as the pessimist. I think people tend to opt for A, what they know, and B, what is easiest. Mm-hmm. So I think unfortunately, we will continue to see a bit of a misunderstanding and a mistranslation of what has traditionally been a legacy sort of strategy, security strategy, things like defense in depth and the like, applied to the cloud a bit erroneously. It's unfortunate because I do genuinely believe that that if there was ever a time to really change the whole game of how we approach security, that this is it. The infrastructure is completely changing versus what we had, prior, when these legacy solutions were maybe not so relevant. Mm-hmm. I think that I think that making things easier is really the only way to get us to get people to adopt these or to sort of abandon these legacy sort of mindsets. I don't think we're there now. I think we could reasonably get there, but it will take a significant amount of effort, and that, to me, is a barrier to entry. If things aren't easy, if things aren't fast, you're going to skip over them.
Yeah, it's a good point. So you're kind of not saying it won't happen, but you're kind of saying it will happen either. So you're kind of going in between here, right?
I don't mean to be wishy-washy about it. I think things will continue to be sort of slanted to the legacy component until such a point where there isn't this barrier to entry to having these default security solutions baked into the cloud. So make it, when they become easy as a toggle, or become as easy as a couple of checkboxes or a hamburger button, I think that will change things significantly. But right now, I don't think it's easy enough. I don't think it's straightforward enough, and thus what has already been known, what is well understood, remains attractive, even if it's not necessarily the most appropriate solution.
Yes. I think that I agree with that. I think that even with cloud providers who are quite serious about security, we still see a fair amount of, hard work required to actually be secure. So in that sense, Gartner position about it being a customer fault would probably has a decent chance of continuing to be true unless we change how we build some of the controls. Because admittedly, enabling certain things in public cloud providers today, whether you use any of the big three, are not always intuitive. And so I would not say even most of our controls fit all the requirements we put in. So Matt, any views from you on this?
I'm funny. I see where you guys are coming from. I'd like to take the optimistic side of things and say that no, change can really happen. I think Brandon, you brought up a good point, and I think kind of one of my biggest takeaways from that, and hopefully those of you watching here, you can pinpoint this in your organization too, is if you try to approach, and this is like one of the cruxes of this whole argument, right? If you try to approach cloud security from a legacy security perspective, it's not going to work out on either side. If you're a cloud provider who doesn't understand what it's supposed to be, then you're not going to be able to give your customers what they need. And if you're a customer who doesn't understand how it can be applied correctly or how you should modernize your terms, you're not going to be looking for security correctly implemented either. I think the easier you can make it, or the more integrated it can become, the less problem you were seeing. Brandon, that kind of goes to what you were talking about. But there's one other advantage I'll throw in here. And I'm convinced that this is going to be much more than cloud security, but I'll keep the scope focused here. I think, as we have a more experienced developer world, I think as we have more people who grew up and who learned and who trained and who we're educated on modern computing principles. I really, really want to hope and think, and maybe it'll be by 2025, maybe by 2035, who knows. But I really, really hope that we will start to see a shift towards like a security first thinking, where both developers as well as cloud providers are both saying to each other, no, this isn't secure enough, right? This is not the way we want things to be. And I think to Brandon's point from way earlier on, we were talking about legacy protocols and Anton, some of the things that you mentioned from that legacy belief perspective, I have to think that the more and more people become familiar with and they understand deploying, like let's just take something like a TLS enabled website, right? Someone who's deploying an HTTPS site correctly, certificates are done correctly, encryption is done correctly, you know, everything's done the right way. I think the more those habits become commonplace, I would like to think that the cloud providers will react accordingly, because who's really going to demand this change? It's going to be the customer base. And I hope our customers will mature a lot faster than a lot of these surveys really give them credit for. But, you know, the problem is that there's a lot of legacy knowledge we've got to shake here. So I really hope so. I hope the answer to this question is I really, really hope we can. I don't know if it'll be by 2025, but I really hope at some point we're going to hit a precipice of just exhaustion of lack of security. And then we're going to have it's going to become a downward slope of insecure legacy implementations versus, you know, folks that are just hungry and starving for something more secure. I hope.
Yes, and I think that I like that line of thinking. Basically that we are actually on a positive direction, so the change may happen. And while we may be kind of doomed to repeat mistakes for a good number of years, ultimately the trend is down. The trend for the mistakes is down. So ultimately we will have the infrastructure, we will have the systems that allow us to do it securely using these principles or using similar ideas to make security just show up and make insecure deployment unlikely. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and I'll add one other thing to that too, which is, you know, I think and it's funny because a lot of students that I teach and a lot of students I work with, I ask them the question, you know, is encryption good or bad? And I'll just pick on a secure website perspective here, but I'll say, is encryption good or bad? And there's never a right or wrong answer to that. It's always like, well, if it's my data, it's good, right? If it's data that I need to analyze, it's bad. But where I let that conversation lead to is I say, you know, look at like the implementation of Let's Encrypt, for example, as a certificate authority now. Has that made the adoption of security practices easier? For sure.
Yes,
Does it mean people actually understand what's going on? Not necessarily, but I think that number is growing, but it's a little bit slower than the others. And I think when that number, the second one, reaches maybe a more critical point, that's when the market will start to respond accordingly. I hope. Again, yes. I hope.
I think that's a good example. I mean, Let's Encrypt and a few other examples where certain security controls, it doesn't matter, security measures of some sort, have become pervasive without requiring hard work. That to me is a good, hopeful message. So let me kind of switch to the final slide with recommendations. And I think, admittedly, for a somewhat non-technical webinar, they're not about like changing code, but I do think that some of them are very useful to remember. I think that migration to cloud is a unique opportunity, and by unique, I really mean it. It hasn't happened before. It probably won't happen for a while, to actually do security in a new way. And while there are some impediments, some of them are related to compliance standards, some of them are related to familiarity, some of them are related to other things, there is still a chance to flip the switch and make security just be there. And to me, there are a lot of the cloud provider, a lot of work is by cloud providers, but a fair amount of work is by cloud users as well. Now, I would say that this also means that if you are a user of cloud, if you are a company or an enterprise or a business using cloud computing, there's a lot more you can do to motivate your cloud provider to make it easier for you to secure your assets. And that's what makes the whole 99% would be customer fault a motivation for this. Like, do you want to be always blamed? No? Okay, well, how can the platform provider can make it easy? Well, if you know, tell them. To me, that's a useful thing to think about. And of course, the final reminder is that the joint responsibility model ultimately is forever. This is not changing. There would always be things that only a customer can do. And while the provider can make wrong things or insecure things to be very difficult and the secure things to be either easy or automated. There's ultimately always a choice to run that script, undo security in some way. And in this case, that basically means the joint responsibility model is there and you just blatantly negligent on your end. And if you're hacked, it is truly your fault. Now, we want this to be a very rare case. We don't want this to be a daily occurrence, if it makes sense. Brandon, got anything to add on this?
Sorry, mute buttons are hard. Sorry. Honestly, I think to that point, looking towards the future and removing my pessimist hat a little bit, I think that's reasonable. I think that moving away from the knowledge base that we have anchored ourselves to and maybe letting that go a little bit is really, like what Matt said, really allows us to move into this beautiful future, so to speak.
Okay, no, that makes sense, and I think that, but I think you're not saying beautiful future is impossible. I think that if cloud providers do a fair amount of work and users do some amount of work, that more beautiful future can happen.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, and I think surprisingly enough, we are almost on time. So, admittedly, hopefully links will be clickable in your PDFs that you download. There are blog posts that kind of led to this webinar is the first link, and there are a few other fun reads, some from me, some not from me, that talk about roughly the same topic. Thank you very much for your listening.
All right, well, thank you so much, Matt, Anton, and Brandon for your great presentation, and to Chronicle Security for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.